When Max saw Tashinsky checking both sides of the corridor before stepping into the sick bay, as if afraid that anyone was following him, he immediately suspected something was wrong. But after the Terran research ship Daedalus flight engineer diligently locked the door behind him, the suspicion turned into certainty. "Is there something wrong, Vlad?" Max asked, smiling as nonchalantly as possible. It was still unclear what was happening to Tashinsky, but the experience told Max that the flight engineer's nerves were on edge. Tashinsky pressed his finger to his lips and handed Max a piece of paper with a few scribbled words. "Disconnect communications to the control room," read Max. "Make sure everything is knocked out." Max shook his head, trying hard to keep a smile on his face. "Vlad, you're in the sick bay, not the engine room. Direct communication with the bridge is disabled here by default. But if it makes you feel more comfortable, you're welcome." He swiveled in his chair and pressed a few keys on the communicator's terminal. "There you go. Now, neither sound broadcasting nor surveillance cameras can be turned on without my confirmation. A common practice, so as not to disturb patients or, say, a doctor during the surgery." "I know," the flight engineer said with noticeable relief. "That's why I tried to catch you here." "Okay then," Max said. "You caught me. Now sit down. Let's talk." Tashinsky cautiously lowered himself into the chair, as if he expected it to suddenly come to life and bounce away, or, on the contrary, to grab him. "Doc, I think..." He cast another glance at the door. "I think..." He licked his lips and, gathering his courage, blurted out, "I think there's something wrong with the captain." Max looked thoughtfully at the flight engineer. "Something wrong? Could you be more specific, Vlad?" Tashinsky's face showed a mixture of despair and determination. "Doc, I think the captain is somewhat messed up. I mean, there's something going on with his head, you know." Max nodded. "So you believe me?" Tashinsky asked. "Vlad, this is our third year on the Daedalus," Max said. "This is the longest and farthest expedition in the history of space exploration. Over 100 hyperjumps, 18 planets explored. Everyone is tired. The tension is enormous. No wonder we might be acting a little unusual." The flight engineer shook his head furiously. "Doc, you don't understand. The captain, he's talking to God." Max squinted his eyes. "Interesting. I've never noticed any tendency toward religiousness in Joseph. Didn't you notice what denominational affiliation he chose?" "Denominational... what?" Tashinsky stared at Max. "Well, what does he do when, in your opinion, he talks to God? Singing psalms, reciting Buddhist sutras, maybe something from the more primitive cults, like communicating with ancestors." Max sighed. "Vlad, it may seem strange to you, but the drift toward religion among spacemen, especially on long-distance expeditions or isolated scientific stations, is a fairly common phenomenon. People are not psychologically adapted for interaction with galactic expanses, so our consciousness tries to create a protective buffer, shielding it from the merciless and indifferent space. Religion is the best way to do that." "I don't..." Tashinsky shrugged. Max's specific question and explanation had obviously stumped him. I don't know, Doc. I don't know much about this psychological stuff, and I don't know much about religion. Jesus, this is the 26th century. We can't be seriously talking about the intergalactic religion. Max smiled even softer. Jesus, you say? Tashinsky blushed. Doc, come on. It's just an expression. Everybody says that. Some may put little more meaning into it than others. I just wanted to remind you that the roots of religion are much more deeply embedded into us than we may realize. It's not surprising that in a stressful situation, they can sprout unexpectedly. So you think it's nothing? Asked the flight engineer, looking at Max with timid hope. Do you think I may be overreacting? Max shook his head. Not at all. As the chief medical officer of the expedition, I am responsible for the mental health of all crew members. Information about such changes is critical to my work. I must incorporate it into my therapy sessions. Don't worry, your visit will remain confidential, he reassured an anxious Tashinsky. But it will be easier for me to base my next session with Joseph on what you have already told me. He paused for a moment thinking. Just to put your mind at ease, let me tell you something. It's somewhat out of line with my professional ethics, but I think it's acceptable in our situation. As you know, this is my third expedition. And in both previous ones, there have been cases of crew members turning to religion. They were not captains, but, nevertheless, they were people who in no way could have been previously suspected of being inclined to mystical thinking. One had even quit the Corps on his return to Earth and become a preacher. The flight engineer sat silent for a while. All right, he said at last. I'll take it. You have convinced me, Doc. Maybe we really are all a little more tired than we're willing to admit. Of course we are, Max said. Even your reaction to a fairly innocuous observation suggests you could use a little rest and mental relaxation too. You know, let's do one thing. He pressed a couple of keys on the central terminal of the medical bay and looked at the list on the screen. Your virtual reality relaxation session is scheduled for next Tuesday, but I think we can move the date up a bit. Come back to me, say, the day after tomorrow, okay? And meanwhile, I'll think about how important what's going on with the captain is. But I think it will all work out. Trust my experience. Tashinsky stood up and extended a broad palm. Thanks, Doc, he said, shaking Max's hand. You've calmed me down. I was beginning to think we're in trouble. When I saw the captain talking to the shining cloud on the bridge, and it dictated to him the coordinates for the jump to the gates of heaven, he didn't finish, waved his hand, and, quickly tapping the door lock panel, left the sick bay. Max sat for a while, looking at the door closing behind the flight engineer, then reached out and turned on the communicator. Joseph, we have a problem, he said to the captain, who looked questioningly at him from the screen. Tashinsky's face under the virtual reality connection helmet radiated peace and serenity. It was so much in contrast to the bulky device, which looked like a cybernetic squid that encased the flight engineer's head in the embrace of thousands of tenacious, thin tentacles. Joseph Casales, the captain of the research ship Daedalus, took one last look at Tashinsky, who was lying on the soft bed of the relaxation pod, and turned to Max. "Are you sure this is necessary?" he asked. "I don't like such deceiving moves for keeping the crew in the dark, given the greatness of the moment ahead." Max sighed. "Do you think I like it myself? But I don't see any other way out. Your inexcusable mistake left me no choice." The captain looked embarrassed. "It was the end of the night watch. I was sure everyone was asleep. But you're right, I should have at least blocked the door to the bridge. I hope it doesn't screw up the whole plan. I haven't been honored with the manifestation since. It worries me. Only 24 hours left until the estimated jump time," Max said. "There's nothing to worry about. Just think of our place in history. The first people who managed to find the route to the gates of heaven, not after death but in the real world, even if it wasn't without divine intervention." "Yes, it's easy to work when you're guided by God himself," Joseph nodded. "Though I'm still not sure if it was him or one of the angels." He grinned. "It's the kind of thing where you wish there were chaplains on spaceship crews in addition to doctors and shrinks. We could use the help of a good theologian." "Well, you were able to calculate the course without a priest," Max said. "We'll probably have all the answers when we get there." He looked at the serene Tashinsky. "It's a pity Vlad will miss this moment, but we can't take any chances. I hope we can be forgiven for this little precaution. I think the lack of manifestation should be interpreted in this sense. Our celestial contacts don't want to do all the work for us. They've given us the key, and it's up to us to use that key as we see fit." "It makes me feel better when you put it that way," the captain said. "I'll admit I've had a hard time with all this." "So much work with the calculations?" Max asked. "That too, of course," the captain answered. "But the divine manifestations are things to endure by themselves. I don't know how Moses did it. Maybe talking to a burning bush was okay for people of that era. Certainly not for me. You know, I've never been religious. And who is these days?" "That's what I've told Vlad," Max smiled sadly, nodding at Tashinsky in the pod. "And the funny thing is, nothing has changed. Believing is one thing, knowing is another. And that's our advantage over all those theologians in the past millennia, isn't it?" the captain said. "We will bring knowledge instead of faith to mankind. All right, I'm going to the bridge. It's time to set up the final jump." "See you in heaven," winked Max. The usual dizziness after coming out of the hyper jump gradually passed, and everything began to acquire clarity. Max blinked a few times to add sharpness, the visual analog of divers swallowing to clear blocked ears. It was common practice to have a doctor in the control room during the long hyper jumps. It's always good to have someone in the heart of the ship who knows best how to deal with post-jump disorientation. Nearby in his berth, Captain Casales was slowly coming to his senses. Stretching awkwardly, he turned his head, and his gaze met Max's. "We did it," the captain finally said. "We made the jump." "Both literally and figuratively," Max nodded. "Booked a place in all the history books. But I don't see where—" He didn't finish. A blinding white glow flooded the bridge, which instantly turned from the pinnacle of human scientific thought into a pitiful kennel of primitive savages. The captain and the doctor were breathless. Tears of rapture welled up in their eyes. Here it was, that pure white light, and they were the first to have the honor of reaching it alive. "I wasn't sure before," said the captain, painfully searching for the words. "Even after all the manifestations, I could not fully believe, but now I see, I testify." Max watched, stunned, as from the golden whiteness he had never known that such a color could exist. A majestic figure gradually emerged, wreaking unimaginable power and authority. Saint Peter? Archangel Michael? Or— "Wrong guess," came a mighty voice that cut through the space not only in sound range, but seemed to penetrate the very essence of humans. But not so much so that Max didn't feel some confusion. These were not the words he had expected to hear at the gates of heaven. "You never cease to amaze me," the voice continued. "After all these years, you still haven't learned anything. You are still as easy to deceive. All that is needed is to offer some kind of bait." "Who are you?" Max barely managed to squeeze out the question. Beside him, an equally shocked Captain Casales was shaking his head as if trying to get something out of his brain. "Isn't it written in all of your holy books that he does not engage in petty trading and does not sell tickets to the end station?" the voice said, while the figure began to take on a clearer shape. "But no, you want simple solutions." Max was suddenly horrified to realize that the magnificent glow was also beginning to change, darkening with the ominous purple. "I'm sorry, guys, but the trade of simple solutions is exclusively in my department," the voice said. "Well, welcome to the gates. It's only that you have come to the wrong end of the road." And the black horned figure, shining with a full-fanged grin, stepped into the control room, bringing with it a raging sea of flames and the smell of sulfur.